Hi, folks. You're Tacitus today. Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about the during World War II. When did Hitler and the government and the German High Command? When did they realise that the war was lost? Now, there's many theories floating around this, but most of them tend to focus on the final few months of the war, or at least late into 1943 and even into 1944, before they call it that they realised the war was lost, or in all probability was lost. This idea that the German military machine, including the government, was run by a series of lunatic madmen doesn't really hold up. We're looking at the most efficient military machine, certainly in modern history, that's ever existed, and even today is upheld as the gold standard for army and military logistical efficiency. So the idea that the most successful, well-run, well-organized, well-trained military machine in the world was also run by the biggest idiots that ever exist, the two just don't go together. The German generals and the people involved in the military machine were of the highest caliber, and that was reflected in their string of unbroken victories. You don't defeat the armies of Britain and France in 6 weeks unless you're pretty well put together, well organized, and well planned. Some of the greatest tactical thinkers and strategists, military strategists that existed in the world at the time were all German, and the caliber again of the German officer corps was very high, as indeed was the standard of their NCOs, their non-commissioned officers and so on. Now, looking at the issue, when did the Germans, German government and military, when did they figure that the war was lost? Well, there's some very serious doubts about whether or not the war could be won, or that it could be won quickly. Already, even at the latter part of 1941, and this often goes unrecognised, and certainly into 1942, before Stalingrad, well before Stalingrad, there were already very serious concerns, including Hitler. Hitler had calculated on the raw materials that were needed, oil being primary among them, for victory to be achieved, and Hitler was already openly declaring in early 1942 that unless they capture the oil fields around on the eastern side of the Black Sea, down in the Caucasus Mountains there, unless they, Baku and also, unless they capture those oil fields, or more importantly, capture them intact so they can pump the oil, unless they get those oil fields, they're really going to struggle to win. So, and certainly, they're going to be relying on various other factors, such as the Allies falling out and getting into all sorts of dispute themselves. So Hitler was already concerned at that point that it was going to be that the outcome was in doubt. And again, this is in early 1942. So let's just go through the sort of the timeline now. That the Hitler and the general staff, overall, had expected a fairly quick victory, or a likely quick victory, in the Soviet Union, Soviet Russia, and they expected political collapse to occur after a series of military victories. They were confident they could get the military victories, but they assumed, or on balance, they believed it very likely that the Soviet machine, government, the communist government, would collapse, and that they could then just dictate terms and so on. And that wasn't an unreasonable view. It was quite a reasonable one under the circumstances. There are a few things that encouraged this. Firstly, was the Germans had watched the Russians coming into eastern Poland in 1939. This is September, October 1939. And they'd seen how clumsy the Russians were, and the Red Army, as it was called, the Soviet Army, and they watched that and they thought that was a pretty pathetic effort. And German military observers were watching this and and they could see just how badly organised they were, logistically, how hopeless they were, how piss poor the officers were, and so on. So this was all noted. They also saw Russia's or the Soviet Union's invasion of Finland. The Soviet government wanted to, Stalin and those guys wanted to reorder or reposition the border with Finland. There was a bit of pushing and shoving about, well, give us this territory and we'll give you that. And, there was a bit of to and fro there, but the Finnish government turned it down. So the Soviet Union decided to invade Finland. And it was a fiasco. The Red Army suffered hundreds upon hundreds of thousands of casualties, lost goodness knows how much equipment. And again, the logistical machine, the supply machine, the whole thing just broke down. And it was only a sheer force of numbers, the Finnish army being very small and the Soviet army being huge, that permitted the final victory. But there's a few takeaways, I guess, in this was, and if the Germans and others had sort of taken notice of it, it showed that the Soviet government was very ideologically driven. They were prepared to accept huge casualties, massive collateral damage in order to get what they wanted. So their position and views and attitudes and methodologies were very ideological, and that should have indicated a clue that the Soviets are prepared to take huge casualties in protection of what they would see as their ideological sort of outlook on government and social organisation, communism in this case. So the German planners had watched all this and decided that they could quite easily defeat the Soviet armed forces, the Red Army and so on, using the blitzkrieg tactics. Now, this was something of a little. I think they'd made an error, but I don't believe that people of that caliber wouldn't have known this. I'm sure they would have. Blitzkrieg is been very effective, whether it's in dealing with Britain and France or anywhere else. Blitzkrieg was effective because it would choose a narrow front, would break that narrow battlefront, and then fan out behind the enemy's logistics and support lines of communication, disrupt all the road deliveries, capture airfields, destroy radio transmission towers, and so on and so forth. Now, once you've got an army that can't receive orders or instructions and doesn't know where the enemy is, which if you cut off all their communications, they'll very quickly lose heart. And if they aren't getting reinforcements, or they're not getting ammunition supplies coming through, so they wouldn't if you've disrupted the rear areas, which Blitzkrieg did and did very well, then armies tend to either cease to be an effective fighting force or they surrender, which is what the general intention of Blitzkrieg is. Now, it's a bit different. The Germans were operating or had operated on Western European roads with multiple different roads going in all sorts of different directions, and so they could move their armies around fairly quickly to decisive effect. Now, in the Soviet Union, the roads were few, the railways were poor and were few as well, and there was no single point of penetration in a battlefront that could decide a complete outcome. If the battlefront's a few hundred kilometres across, you can, but if the battlefield's nearly 1,000 kilometres across, then it's much harder to do, and you need much more force to apply because the force dilutes as you travel a greater distance and depth. Similarly, in Western Europe, or Europe generally, where the German war machine had been successful, their primary political and logistical objectives were, 100 or 200 kilometres away from the point of penetration in the battlefront, whereas those key political and logistical objectives were nearly 1,000 kilometres away from the initial point of penetration. So it's a very different sort of force to space ratio that the Germans were dealing with here. So a very key component of what they expected was or anticipated, maybe hoped for is a better word, was that there would be political collapse after a series of victories. Now, if you look at just the size of the victories that the German war machine was having, in Battle of Vyazma-Bryansk, for example, there was nearly 700,000 casualties inflicted on the Soviets. Battle of Kiev, 550,000. In the various frontier battles, 1.5 million over a series of 2 or 3 battles. So across five battles, in prisoners, in deaths and wounded, the Germans had inflicted over 3 million casualties on the Red Army just in the space of the first 5 months. There's a few things that the Wehrmacht, the German war machine and their planners hadn't counted on, was the speed with which and the recklessness with which the Soviet government would conscript new soldiers, give them a week's training, and then just throw them into the battlefront as really militia units, but in such vast numbers that the Germans still had to stop and deal with them before they could move forward. And also the Germans didn't count on the amount of tanks that the Russians. Now, some of these tanks weren't very good, but when the Russians had over 20,000 tanks, the Soviets had over 20,000 tanks, for example. Not all of them were good, and not all of them were top quality. They were poorly maintained, and the tank crews were poorly trained. And there was a saying that was going around that the main guns, the cannons on the Soviet tanks, were only good for shooting sparrows. That was absolute absurd nonsense. Even the low caliber tanks, had either 30 mil or 45 mil main guns on them, which was more than enough to knock out any of the quite lightly armored German tanks of the day. So now. There was a fateful meeting in early November 1941, 12 months before Stalingrad, and the Germans have just won a huge victory at Vyazma-Bryansk in October, and so they're meeting in November. The rainy season has just started, so again, given there's very few roads, the dirt tracks that serve as roads around. That greater Moscow area at the time, and we're talking like a couple of 100 kilometers from Moscow, I guess, at this point, they turned into a quagmire. If you've ever, for those who haven't sort of been out on in areas without roads but that are taking heavy equipment, I've spent quite a bit of time on the mines out in the middle of outback Australia, and these roads that are so hard they feel like concrete. They're just dirt roads. But when it rains, it doesn't have to rain that much, and the caterpillar tracks of the heavy equipment churn the stuff up, so it becomes like a river of mud, that can go sort of close to a metre deep. So anything in there flounders in the mud and doesn't go anywhere. But within a few hours of the sun coming out, the road, what was a river of mud a few hours ago, turns into a hard as concrete, road again. It's quite remarkable. I wouldn't have believed it if I hadn't seen it in my own eyes. But so the rainy seasons come. The German war machine is kind of ground to a halt. It can't really go anywhere. They're moving very slowly in order to move the tanks and the trucks and everything. They have to use what's called log roads. So they're cutting trees down and putting logs on the mud, the river of mud that was the road, and they're moving things along that way, which is very slow and torturous. There's a lot of belief at the time, and I believe that it had the Germans started their assault on Moscow, which Vyazma-Bryansk was a part of it, and they'd started, say, in early or middle September, then they probably would have captured Moscow, and the war may have ended at that point. But because they left it a bit later, and then the rainy season started a bit earlier, then the assault on Moscow was slowed down from 20 plus kilometers a day traveling to 2 kilometers a day. So it was a very different sort of transport and logistics situation in that mud. Then the winter frosts came and the ground sort of hardened up again with the winter frost. Now, at this point, when the winter frosts arrived, the German General Staff met and they had to make a fateful decision. Did they continue the assault towards Moscow, which they believed would deliver victory? Even if it delivered victory, Moscow was the central rail hub for the whole of Russia. So if Moscow was neutralized, at least as a transport hub, it also had something like 8% of the total Soviet weapons manufacturing of the time. So if Moscow was captured, not only would they lose the Red Army and the Soviet government would lose that absolutely vital railway hub, but they would also lose another 8% of the manufacturing. And given they'd lost some in the order of a third of the manufacturing already in the area that the German army had overrun at that point. So they made this decision: do we go, or they debated it? Do we go forward to Moscow, or do we stop and dig in and prepare for the winter? They know the winter's almost upon them, and they know they don't really have the resources to fight in the winter snows. And so it's a serious decision. They decide in the end that the Russians have been so, the Red Army has been so slapped around and beaten up that they can actually push ahead and they can capture Moscow. And then when they've captured Moscow, then they can start bringing up the supplies such as, warm winter boots and winter clothing and so on, which the troops don't really have much of. So they've got a limited logistical capacity. So the Germans decide, well, we'll put that logistical capacity into bringing up ammunition and weapons and that sort of stuff to continue prosecuting the offensive, and we'll leave behind the warm clothing and the winter boots and the food supplies that we would otherwise bring up. Now, this was a fateful meeting. I mean, the whole world, I think, turned on this meeting, and with hindsight, it probably is one of the most important meeting in terms of ramifications of the entire World War II. Had the Germans decided to say, well, look, we'll dig in here and dig in with defensive positions, and we'll start bringing up the cold weather clothing and bringing up the supplies and so on, and we'll just have to wait the winter out. We thought we'd have this nailed before the winter, but we haven't. We've got to realistically accept that and be prepared to continue prosecute the offensive operations in spring of 1942. And anyway, and Hitler probably wasn't pushing things too hard either way. I mean, he would prefer a quick end to the war, but he more or less left it to the generals on this one. And they decided that they would continue the offensive. This was pivotal because the Germans didn't possess the offensive power at this stage. And it was vital that as the cold weather was coming on, they weren't bringing up the necessary supplies again, such as, warm coats and boots and so on. So they're taking a super high risk. If they didn't win quickly from that point onwards, their troops and soldiers would freeze to death, which is sort of what happened. Now, the Russians, by contrast, did have, cold weather clothing and boots and coats and all that sort of stuff. So they could engage in offensive operations almost with impunity because, again, the German soldiers didn't have, they had something like 1 in every 3 had warm clothing. So when the Russians delivered a half-assed, poorly coordinated, amateurish counterattack in the 5th of December 1941, unless it was an established defensive position, the Germans had some of those. But outside of that, the Russians just effectively walked through the snow and met no opposition. And if you're a soldier with 40 degrees below and all you've got is a summer coat or something like that, and no socks and boots that are sort of worn away, you'll get frostbite and you'll lose your toes and your fingers within minutes of going out in that sort of weather. So the Red Army just walked through vast areas of what was the front line, and it was only the established defensive positions where the Red Army was, the amateur soldiers were cut to pieces. But they were able to overrun German positions, take many hundreds of tanks and weapons, weapons, ammunition dumps, this sort of stuff, and it was quite a hit that the Germans took, and they never really fully recovered from that. And there was quite some speculation amongst some of the German military thinkers, even Hitler included, where they were now very worried that they actually missed their chance. They'd missed the opportunity for a quick victory. Whereas if they dug in for the winter, as some were advocating, the Soviet Red Army counterattack would have just torn itself to pieces on the defensive position, German defensive positions, and hundreds of thousands of troops would have been just thrown at the counterattack for no purpose. Come the spring, then the Germans could have renewed the offensive and probably would have taken Moscow at that point and maybe ended the war or certainly come close to it. But anyway, that was it. Now, come 1942, the Russians made another, emboldened by the Moscow counterattack, they made another couple of counterattacks in and around Crimea and in and around Kharkov in modern-day Ukraine, and they suffered crushing defeats in both of those, losing close to 600,000 men. This then encouraged the Germans to think, no, things are all right. We've just inflicted some crushing defeats on the Russians, on the Red Army, so we can renew the offensive and maybe win this war. Now, at this stage, Hitler is now pushing hard for, no, we've got to get the oil. We're going to really struggle to win this war if we don't get the oil. And things like rubber, the Germans were down to one rubber wheel per, out of every 20 wheels that needed rubber, they had one rubber tire. It was that bad on rubber, and of course oil was in short supply. So, and the demand for oil was increasing. The reserves of oil the Germans had built up, was almost gone. They were getting close to living hand to mouth for oil coming from the Romanian oil fields. And so there was very much concern. Already you can see a lot of communications between the officers, again, Hitler included, where they were becoming quite anxious about the outcome of the war already at this point. Even though they're winning, again, victory after victory, it's not enough given the range of resources against them. Now, at this stage, Hitler still hasn't put Germany on a complete war footing. It's still running at maybe, a few percent below peacetime activity, economic activity. And sure, there are things like they're using, various chemical substitutes for petrol and, things like that. But the people basically aren't really going through a wartime situation. Makeup and hosiery and so on for women and hairstylists are still open and, all that sort of stuff. So it's not far from being on a war footing, unlike Britain and the Soviet Union that are on, a desperate war footing in terms of the availability of consumer goods, rationing and so on. Now, when the Germans launched the Wehrmacht launched their summer offensive, or late spring summer offensive in 1942, Operation Blue, they found that the Russians the Red Army had most of their troops around Moscow. They'd given that priority for protecting. And they had quite a few troops in the south and elsewhere, but they didn't regard that as the number one priority at the moment. And they decided to set fire to the oil fields if they looked like they were going to fall into German hands and so they weren't particular about defending the oil fields, but were particular about denying them to the Germans. The Americans had promised the Russians that if you lose your oil fields, we'll supply you with oil, so don't worry. I don't know if it had come to that, whether that would have worked out too well, but that was the promise. Now the when the Germans were approaching Stalingrad, as it looked like the Soviet Red Army front was disintegrating, as it appeared it was at the time. And I think German intelligence sort of failed a little bit there. They didn't realize just how many troops were really around defending, Moscow. But it looked like, final victory was at hand. And that's when, again, another fateful decision was made, with Hitler playing a role this time, but also the general staff going along with. They figured victory was at hand, so they sent a motorized Panzer army to take Stalingrad, because they wanted to disrupt the river traffic, which was quite, and the rail traffic coming from the south. And but they figured Stalingrad would fall into their hands easily. So they decided to, and it would only have taken a few more days, and they could have taken Stalingrad without a fight at that point. And Stalingrad was a reasonable sized, something like 5% of all the tanks that were being made were made in Stalingrad. It would have been worth taking. But instead of doing that, they ordered the Panzer Army that could have walked into Stalingrad and taken it. They decided to, no, Stalingrad, we can get that anytime we want. And they sent the tanks down to the oil fields, because they're going to get those oil fields. Now, that was quite a long drive for the tank, a lot of wear and tear, and they didn't really have the spare parts at this point. So if tanks wore out or there was a lot of repair and maintenance issues, they didn't really have the support in terms of spare parts to remedy that. So that was another high risk venture. But considering that they thought victory was close at hand, they thought these risks were worth taking. With hindsight, of course, they weren't. But as the Sixth Army, the one that ultimately surrendered in Stalingrad, was working its way along the major riverbank there towards Stalingrad, more and more Soviet troops, Red Army troops, were starting to contest its advance, and were starting to arrive in Stalingrad. So as the Sixth Army got to Stalingrad, and German troops were arriving there at almost the same rate as Soviet troops were entering from the other side of the Don River. So it ended up being a street fighting shit fight in Stalingrad, which achieved nothing. Hitler, victory was at hand, and they would capture the oil fields. It was just going to take a bit more of an effort, but in fact, as soon as the Stalingrad, and Hitler was even sending panzer divisions off on vacation. He was so confident of victory at this stage. Now, the Russians had launched a counterattack just north of, or just south of Moscow, and they suffered a heavy defeat there with hundreds of thousands of casualties. And so the German high command figured that was it. That the Soviet Red Army had shot their bolt for 1942, and they couldn't do anything else, not realizing that there were nearly 250,000 new and green and untrained, or minimally trained Soviet troops that were moving towards Stalingrad. Now, the Germans could have easily defeated this very green, badly led Soviet army just around Stalingrad. But instead, they were obsessed with getting the oil, or again, sending troops on vacation to France and this sort of thing. So, whereas the Germans possessed the offensive power, the military power to defeat such a Soviet attempt, the Stalingrad encirclement, they just didn't have the resources in situ that they needed at that time, which was a serious oversight. Now, at the point that Stalingrad happens, a sense of gloom, of course, descends over the German war machine, and they're thinking, wow, we've got to go to a war footing now, which Hitler had resisted all along. We've got to put the economy on a war footing. We've got to really, get focused here. Now, around that time, of course, the British are building up their resources in North Africa. The Americans are landing troops in North Africa as well. And there's a realization that the resources of the Reich are no longer sufficient to win the war. And so that's happening in early 1943. No one's going to give up. No one's going to, everyone hopes for the best. They're hoping for fresh victories that might turn it around. They're hoping that the Russians and the Americans and the British fall out and start bickering amongst themselves. But at that point, without a stunning victory of massive proportions, say on the Eastern Front, where they can destroy, 1 million plus Russian soldiers with hardly any casualties to themselves. Something of that scale was needed, and they realised that that was not unlikely at this stage. There was hope that maybe the Americans, being green troops, could be defeated completely in North Africa. That doesn't come to pass. They just didn't simply have the resources to fight along that scale, and to fully resource the army necessary to win such a victory. So really in early 1943, it's already there's an acceptance that winning the war is now unlikely. There just isn't sufficient resources to do it, and the sort of victories that they could have achieved, a year or so earlier, are now quite elusive and much more difficult to come by. And that they're relying on things like the Allies falling out and bickering amongst themselves, and hopefully just the attrition. Hitler, for example, and many of the general staff are saying, well, the Soviets have lost so heavily, many millions of troops have been caught, have been captured or killed or wounded. Their factories have been overrun, all these sorts of things. And they're hoping, well, they just don't have the capacity anymore to fight the sort of war that's to put the resources into winning this. So if we just wear them down and fight war of attrition on the Eastern Front, they'll probably just collapse anyway because of all the losses they've already sustained. So these were the wishful thinking attitudes that the German general staff were, which weren't, by the way, in the realms of the unthinkable or the ridiculous. They were just rather unlikely, and on the balance of probability, weren't going to deliver victory. So I would argue they've decided already in early 1943 that winning the war is going to be a very difficult prospect and very unlikely. And given the thoughts that Hitler was already having about oil and the lack of it in early 1942, we can see already severe doubts and anxieties creeping in even at that point. You've been with Tacitus today, you Pushback Challenge. Thank you for listening.